This week on Real America, we're looking back to the 1966 campaign for governor of California when Democratic incumbent Edmund Pat Brown was challenged by Republican Ronald Reagan. Up next, Mr. Reagan's appearance, a day after Mr. Brown's, before employees of the Pacific Gas and Electric Company in San Francisco. He argues that it's time for a political outsider to govern California, and he soundly defeated Governor Brown 4 days later, launching his political career. This one-hour program comes to us courtesy of Pacific Gas and Electric and the Hoover Institution Archives.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the 12th program of our Politics 1966 series, ladies and gentlemen. Before getting into the program, I wish to extend a compliment to all of you for the interest and enthusiasm you have shown by your attendance and participation in this series. Meeting with the candidates for state offices, hearing their views on the issues, and engaging them in question and answer discussion helps us as responsible citizens to exercise our voting franchise intelligently and constructively. It will be of interest to our distinguished guest today to know that so far in this series, we have been addressed by the candidates of both parties for Treasurer, Controller, Attorney General, and Lieutenant Governor, and one of the gubernatorial candidates, Mr. Brown, was here yesterday. I am pleased to tell our guest that there are 4 sponsors of this series: the company, the Employees Association, and the 2 unions which represent PG&E employees. The sponsors are represented by those seated here on the platform with Mr. Reagan. Now then, to the business of the day. In tune with the spirit of the coming season, may I say there are only 4 more shopping days left for governor. It has been a long and interesting campaign. It has been, I am sure, an arduous one for the candidates. We are grateful that these busy candidates found time to come here, especially this week in the hectic home stretch. It is a privilege for us to see and hear from them in person. It is my personal privilege to present to you a man who has made a meteoric rise in the political scene in both our state and the nation. We've all known him through media other than politics for many years. And he's more than casually familiar with our industry, having served for so long as a special representative of the General Electric Company, as you will recall. Ronald Reagan, Republican candidate for governor of our great state, has a rich background in Americana. He might be described typically as the boy next door who made good in about everything he undertook in life, frequently overcoming obstacles to do so. Briefly, here are the highlights of his career. He was born in Illinois, worked his way through Eureka College during the Depression years of 1928 to 1932, waiting on tables, washing dishes, and teaching swimming. While earning his degree in economics and sociology, he also managed to play varsity football, to captain the swimming team, and to serve as student body president. In his early career after college, he was a sports broadcaster for the Chicago Cubs and the Chicago White Sox, Big Ten football games, and also Notre Dame. Later, after he became engaged in the movie career for which we all know him so well, he served for 14 years as president of the Screen Actors Guild. He also served as a member of the board of directors of that organization for the same period. He served 2 terms as president of the Motion Picture Council and 10 years as a member of the council's board. Although he has not run for public office before, he has been no stranger to the world of politics and the issues of the political scene. His famous televised speech on behalf of the Republican candidate for president in the 1964 election was so well received across the nation that Mr. Reagan has been prominent in the political arena ever since. Through his long career as a motion picture and television star, we've all known Ronnie Reagan for many years and favorably. Many of us, until recently, knew little of his long devotion to public service. As a member of a hospital board of directors and as a director of the Committee on Fundamental Education, for example. In addition, he is a businessman who operates a successful horse breeding and cattle ranch, and his accomplishments, honors, and awards are many. His lovely wife, Nancy, has proved to be a competent and popular as well as attractive running mate for him. They have 2 children, Patricia and Ronald. And so, with this all too brief introduction, it is my pleasure to present to you Ronald Reagan, Republican candidate for the governor of California. Mr. Reagan.
Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. And I'm sure that all of you recognize someone who followed me into the room here and who's been with me for the last few days, a gentleman from our industry, Chuck Connors. In case there's any question, Chuck's an actor. But he's a concerned citizen and interested in the affairs of the state and the nation and his community. Well, I am appreciative of what you're doing and what this particular meeting represents, because I think a great many people have been concerned back through the years about an apathy among American people. We've gone through a period in which we forgot that if we didn't run government, government would run us. And now, and thanks to companies, to organizations, to people like yourselves doing this, in a sense of participate, not how you participate or on which side, but just involve yourself, I think we have cured that apathy, and I think there is abroad today a new spirit in the land. My opponent in this race, in the last week or two, going up through the Central Valley, he said that while he's been building California for the last 8 years, I gathered by himself, he asked what I'd been doing, and then he said I'd been making movies and appearing on TV, and that's correct. I've been making a living. And I can't help but wonder if there's been some question in his mind about that money that's being spent these last several years, and he doesn't know that it came from people like you and me who've been making a living. Now, I've managed to point out for some time past now, too, that all of my remarks are taped by a representative of the governor. He's been taping everything. As a matter of fact, it's not just the remarks of the speeches, kind of trails me as I walk along with an open mic. I won't even say hello to Nancy when I get home without looking over my shoulder to make sure the mic's in the right place. And I've gotten kind of used to that. As a matter of fact, our people came to me the other day, a few days ago, and said, why don't we do it just for these last few days of the campaign? Why don't we have somebody tape him? And I agreed on one condition, that I wouldn't have to listen. But at first, I was concerned because while there have been some remarks, and there are 1 or 2 magazine writers who do insist on talking about whatever I say in the singular, as if it's the only speech that has been made, I have prepared my own remarks in all the years that I've traveled the mashed potato circuit and up to and including now this period as a candidate. And in the recent weeks of the campaign, as I've heard the governor, after 8 years, suddenly begin talking about rehabilitation and welfare and economy and government and more efficiency and so forth, I've had a kind of uneasy feeling that maybe I've been writing his too. But the thing that's bothered me the most is the use of the scissors, a kind of an editing that's taking place. Now, for example, there is in widespread circulation a quote attributed to me. It's in campaign literature. And this quote has me saying it's a strange paradox in a society a system like ours created on the belief in individual freedom, that parents should be compelled to send their children to school. Now, I said that, every word of it. Said it to a meeting of teachers. But let's take the scissors back out and finish the quote. I said, it's a paradox we gladly put up with because we know we can't have a free system unless we have an educated and literate citizenry. Kind of comes out a little different when you finish the quote, doesn't it? Well, now the governor is concerned over the fact that I've never held public office, and he's never held any other kind of job. But my experience, it's true, has not been in public life. But on the other hand, I don't know of anyone who was ever born holding public office. And I believe that experience can come in a number of ways. I think, for example, the people of Michigan think that George Romney has had experience for his job by reason of his having run an automobile company. Now, you were told in the introduction that my experience was in the field of a national labor organization. I was president 6 terms of my union and on the board and an officer of that union for a total of better than 20 years. And throughout most of those 20 years, I was in charge of, participated in the negotiations across the table, representing some 15,000 of our performers with regard to their wages and working conditions. And I think that we have a record to be proud of. I know one thing that I learned in those negotiations. We asked ourselves, and I don't mean to try and sound noble, but we asked ourselves 3 questions before we ever went to the bargaining table. We looked at our demands and then we said, number 1, is it fair to actors? Good for our people. Number 2, is it fair to the other fellow on the other side of the table? And number 3, is it fair to the public? Because I don't think anyone should approach a negotiating table without representing the public also. Neither management nor labor has a right to negotiate a deal over that table that results in raising the price of the product beyond what the public should fairly pay for it. Now, my experience has turned me inevitably toward the people for the answers to problems. Just instinctively, I find that I believe and put my faith in the private sector of the economy, and a belief in the people's right and ability to run their own affairs. The governor, on the other hand, throughout perhaps this same period of time, has been in public life. And just as automatically and almost instinctively, he seeks the answer to the problems that confront us, inevitably through government. And there's a widespread philosophical difference in this land between people like himself and myself. There are those today who are telling you that because society has grown so big and so complex, that we no longer can afford our traditional system of individual freedom and local autonomy, that we must turn to big government as being the only answer to the big problems now of this big nation. And I say that this is based on a false premise and is completely untrue. You've proven it in your own industry. Big business itself is decentralizing because it's gone through the period of trying to run things with one man at the top and a board of directors, and everything from a requisition for paper clips on down must go on up through channels and come back down through channels, hopefully and eventually. And business is decentralized to capitalize on the abilities of the individuals who are running branches, the managers of plants, to take advantage of their knowledge close at hand, facing the immediate problem. I believe that if we properly analyze this thing that's being forced on us, this idea of big government, we must come to the conclusion that the very reverse of what they're saying is true. That as we grow bigger and more complex and crowd in upon each other, the only way we can make this system work is to return the authority to the echelon of government that is closest to the people. I don't believe that anybody in Sacramento knows as well as the people in San Francisco where a freeway should go in San Francisco. Now, as the governor turns toward government as the answer to the problems, he's centralized more and more power in state government. And in turn, he has been willing to pass that authority on to the central government in Washington. More and more, we see them getting on the hotline to Washington and asking for the answers to the problems. I have articles on my desk written by my opponent, and they express the belief that the problems are too big for individual states anymore. Only can a strong national government do this. But if you analyze again, you cannot possibly envision a government, either national or statewide, that can possibly gather together the people with the genius and the talent to make all the multitudinous decisions that must be made every day in the running of the people's affairs. And so I stand in the philosophy that I've just expressed. But as this state government has usurped this authority from the local communities, from local school boards, it's grown great in bureaucracy, and it's grown great in cost. We have the highest debt of any of the nations, or any of the states of the nation. Well, as a matter of fact, the highest debt of many of the nations also. But we have taxes. Your tax burden, state and local, is $100 per capita higher than the national average. Property tax in California is double the national average and increasing twice as fast as your increase in personal income. Which brings you to that tragic realization that unless something is done about this, when the day comes that we retire on the fixed income of Social Security or pension, we very likely will not be able to live in our own homes because that tax burden continues to rise with the inflationary spiral. And I believe that something must be done that's based on a sounder basis than hoping that the government will do what the government has resisted doing in Washington all these years, and that is to earmark some money and give it back to us. I've been preaching that story and urging the federal government to earmark spending and give it back to the people, well, earmark it for our spending, without running it through those puzzle palaces on the Potomac to give it back to us minus a carrying charge. But there is no such legislation introduced, and the man who first suggested this in the present administration was Mr. Heller, economic advisor to the president. And a few days after he suggested this, he was no longer economic advisor to the president. But for this great size and cost of government, we're leading in all the wrong things. We're first in crime. We have double our proportionate share. Now, I must admit that the taping caught me and I goofed on that one. I made a statement. We have 17% of the crime in the nation here in California. We only have 9% of the population. And at one stage, one 3-month period, we had 27% of all of the bank robberies in the United States were committed here in California. Now, I said that the rapid increase in crime began with the governor's first term as governor. And the very next day, having played the tape, they were out to correct me, and I apologize. I did goof. I was wrong. It did not begin with his first term as governor. It began when he was Attorney General. And beginning with his first term as Attorney General, there has been an increase in crime in California that is roughly 3 times or a little more the increase in population. Until today, we have a crime rate per 100,000 of population that is more than 2.5 times what it was at the end of his first 4 years as Attorney General. We're first in business failures and bankruptcies. As a matter of fact, we have more than the other 5 states that are next in line put together. There is a slump in the country with regard to the building trades, and I'm sure that you're familiar with that. But it is also true that the slump is 5 times greater in California than it is in the rest of the nation. We have declined in this last year 49% in building permits. We are up 38% in mortgage foreclosures, and we have the highest delinquency tax rate for real estate tax since 1930, in those dark days of the Depression. I've tried to talk to issues in this campaign, and I'm going to continue talking the issues. I think one of the issues is the record of this administration, and I think the governor has shown a reluctance to run on that record. One of those issues is smog, and the governor says he's done all that can be done. Now, with all of the divisions between the north and south of California, I'm happy to find that in the last couple of days we at least have this in common: smog. Down in Los Angeles County, Lewis Fuller, our smog or air pollution control officer, estimates that 90% of the smog comes from automobiles, and that's no startling statement. All of us are pretty well aware of that by now. And he warns that control of the exhaust emissions must be intensified and accelerated if smog is to be controlled by 1980. Now, because smog knows no city limits or state boundaries, this same man says that the responsibility rests with the state and the federal governments, and I believe that. And the governor takes a great credit for legislation making smog control devices mandatory on the 1966 cars. But the governor's very quiet as to the word that's out now that the devices aren't doing the job. The Clean Air Quarterly, a state publication, in a recent edition admits that from January 1st to September 30th, surveillance results reported to date indicate a somewhat higher emission level for cars in actual use by the public than the improving ground tests by automobile manufacturers. Reliable sources, in fact, indicate that 50 to 60% of the devices are emitting pollutants that are in excess of the specification limits. And they further believe that certification of these devices should be revoked. Now, the devices cost us an average of $45 each, and their equipment on more than 600,000 of the new cars. This means that a new car buyer, or the new car buyers put together, have paid $30 million for these devices, which evidently are not doing the job. Once again, it is the public that pays. And the situation has reached a point to where the supervisors in our county down there have passed a resolution asking Mr. Fuller to look into the device effectiveness. It's hard to tell which brings the most tears, the smog or the inept leadership in the battle against it. But I believe that this must be something that coordinates the efforts at all levels to bring into play something to solve this problem. And anyone who commutes by air, as I've been doing in the last few months from here to Los Angeles, knows what it's like to see, even out in the open areas of our state, this dirty brown blanket that rises to that certain level. Well, you know, contrary to what you've heard, I've made specific recommendations. Oh, well, actually, lest you think I'm being too partisan, inaccurately, it could be described as a kind of a brownish green. But contrary to what you've heard, I've made specific recommendations on other problems that confront us. I have proposed an actual plan for implementing our labor policies in management and labor relations problems where there's a no man's area in this state, and we've had it for several years. I have made a specific proposal for taking the appointment of judges out of politics once and for all. Specific recommendations for cutting the cost of government and to improve the business climate. I think that public officials are elected for one purpose, to solve public problems. And I believe that you have a right to know where any one of us stands, any candidate, to ask where we stand, to ask what we propose, and to ask what our positions are on issues. I believe, in that context, that there's no point in me trying to correct some of the mistakes or some of the, not mistakes, but misstatements that have been made with regard to my positions. And I would like to suggest that the time has come, I think, when you and I have a right to a legitimate discussion between candidates on where they actually stand and what they actually propose. That we can no longer afford the kind of middle-aged juvenile delinquency that goes along with trying to build a straw man and pretend that someone believes something else, and therefore the people should be against him on the basis of that invented belief. You have a right to make your choice based on what it is we actually propose. And I'm not going to take any more time now. I've been making speeches for several months now, and I think that in this context I could start talking about the issues and perhaps miss something that's of great concern to you, or something that you've been told and you'd rather have more information about. So why don't we just get right to that question and answer situation, and then I've tried to scatter around and give some indication of my approach generally to these problems, but maybe we can get to more specifics if you fire away. So how do we handle this?
Well, thank you, Mr. Reagan. I'll explain how this works. It's our custom here from this time to permit the audience to ask any questions that they may wish to direct to our distinguished speaker. And I respectfully request that our friends of the press with us today withhold their questions during this period, which is reserved for those in the audience. First, the ground rules. If you wish to ask a question, please raise your hand and wait to be recognized. When you are recognized, Mrs. Kathy Meebach, Mrs. Karen Taylor, Mrs. Betty West, or Miss Ann Callaghan will hand you a cordless microphone. Then please stand, give your name and your department, and ask your question as briefly and clearly as possible. With those few rules, I'll yield the podium to Mr. Reagan. The first question, please.
Right here, please. Oh, dear. It'll be a long time for the mic to get there, isn't it?
No, they have several.
Come on.
Robert Gentry, Meter Book Control. I was just wondering, with your beliefs, will you, as yourself, with your beliefs, be able to provide your beliefs without being influenced with the rest of the politics behind you to shove you?
Now, wait a minute. If I heard that correctly, would I be able to implement my beliefs without being influenced by what?
By the rest of the politics. I mean, you have your beliefs.
Yeah.
Can you carry your beliefs out? Do you believe you can, without being pushed the other way?
Well, so far, one of the advantages of not having been engaged in politics is that I can present myself to you, and there are no political IOUs out for collection where I am concerned. I don't offer a New Deal, I offer a no-deal government. And I'm... No one so far has sought to in any way influence or change my philosophy or what I believe. And I have proposed throughout this campaign what I've called my term for a creative society, in which I believe in turning to the people, and the people with the most knowledge of the problems, for their thinking and their answers to them. For example, having mentioned business climate, it is my belief that today the answer to the problem here in California, the need to at least bring us down to the national average in unemployment, and we're 28% above that national average now, even though we're at the low point in the last 6 years in unemployment at this moment, I think due to the war boom in the economy. It would be my intention to ask the leading industrialists and the labor leaders of this state for them to come to us and try to point out to government where it is that government is standing in the way, why it is that we are losing our attractiveness to new industry, that we've dropped in our ability to attract them, why old industries are leaving California. I got quite a jolt the other day when I read that Max Factor, of all things, is leaving Hollywood and going to set up in Illinois because he can no longer operate competitively in the nation under the conditions that are imposed by this bad business climate. But I believe we need to ask the industrial community what it is that government can do in offering tax incentives. How can we remove regressive taxes like the inventory tax? How can we enable industry to come here to absorb the unemployed in our state and to give us the broad-based economy we need? And this is basically my approach to government, a belief in the people. Yes.
Mr. Reagan, this is Pete Cochran, Valuation Department. What is your opinion on the Northwest California Water Project?
Well, I know where the Eel River is. Actually, the water, you're talking now about the extension beyond our present Central California project up into the Northwest area. Well, of course, I happen to be one who's concerned about those who are turning to the federal government to try and resolve this. I think that eventually, beyond a certain date, we are perhaps going to have to search for additional sources of water beyond our own. And the Northwest Project, the Columbia River and the Snake River, has been proposed as one that would use the channel of the Colorado, which certainly is a more economical way to transport water than the building of great canals, and augment the Colorado flow. In the meantime, of course, I think we should be exploring, and we will, I'm sure, continue to explore desalination, which gives us a water supply much closer, but also the recovery of wastewater. And I believe here, the actual rate in this, I heard a Caltech scientist on this the other day said that he believes that right now reclaimed wastewater can be delivered as cheaply as our Central Water Project is doing it. But the Northwest Project, I think, has been the result of a lack of statesmanship. There's a great mistrust on the part of those states with a much smaller population of California. They think that we would be on the taking end while they're giving, and they want to reserve the right up there to have the same growth potential that we've had down here. And we can understand that, and certainly the point of origin rights must be respected anytime. But where I worry about the federal government is it seems to me that there would be more resistance from those other states to joining us in any cooperative venture of this kind through a federal government plan, because there they would know they were outweighed. Politics being what they are, a state with the population of ours is going to have more of a voice in the federal government than those smaller states. And this is why I would think their statesmanship is required to see if we cannot get together the several states involved in a regional approach to this and find out that we can evolve a plan that will respect everyone's rights and certainly respect their future potential. I better...
Question in the back?
One in the back there. I better get away from the one bunch here, or we'll stay in one corner of the room.
Ed Vallejo, Customer Accounting Section. If elected, Mr. Reagan, how will you propose to further the civil rights excuse me, of California citizens?
How would I propose to further the civil rights of the citizens of California? Well, for one thing, I have a great belief that many of the problems that complicate this right now are economic. First of all, this might come as strange to you too at this point of the campaign, to know that all of my life I have been involved, actually emotionally and actively, on the side of eliminating bigotry and prejudice and the practice of discrimination based on that. I think that this kind of bigotry or prejudice is one of the evil sicknesses that besets mankind, and I don't think there's any place for it in our society or our economy. But just as surely I believe that there are limits to what we can achieve all the time and simply through legislation. I don't believe that you can solve the problem, for one, by establishing a precedent that will invade the freedoms of all. And therefore I have opposed legislation that I believe, regardless of the nobility of the purpose, would establish a precedent that would give government a right to invade basic freedoms. I don't believe that we've done enough on the basis of using the prestige of high office in this regard. For example, right now, I would feel that a governor, without asking for legislation, because I am opposed to the Rumford Act, as I'm sure you know, but I would suggest that a governor throughout this state should gather together the community leaders and the communications leaders, and I think should seek out the responsible leadership in the minority groups who want an answer better than taking to the streets in violence. And then I believe that we should mobilize these people to find out all of the abrasive points where we're rubbing and where we're hurting, and see what we can do at the community level to solve these problems voluntarily and in a spirit of goodwill. And I have a number of specifics in this regard of things that I think can be done. But let's get to the economic thing, which I think can solve so many. We don't have ghettos because someone built a wall around them like in some countries abroad and the people are denied the right to move out. We have ghettos economically. And I say that you have got to establish equality of opportunity and job equality for all of our people, so that someone does have the ability to move and choose where he will live economically. And there's a program working in the Watts area of Los Angeles, and I have gone into great detail about this program with Mr. H.C. McClellan of the Los Angeles Chamber of Commerce, who first thought of it right after the Watts riots. And regardless of what anyone may want to say in Sacramento, it is a model for what could be done statewide. Mayor Reagan of Oakland has gone down and interviewed Mr. McClellan and has started to put into effect some of the things that were working there. Because by literally forcing the cooperation of government with the private sector who had the jobs to offer, they have put into effect a plan that in little more than a year has put 12,000 of the unemployed in that area into jobs in the private sector of the economy through job training. And a few weeks ago they went into the Watts area with 35 good-paying bus driver jobs and couldn't find anyone unemployed qualified to take one of those 35 jobs. This is how successful it's been. And I have proposed a thing called Job Opportunities Board, which would involve the cooperation of welfare and the state labor department and the federal job training program, as well as many private funds and organizations that are involved in this field, and the private sector of the economy, to direct people particularly from welfare into these jobs, but at the same time to gather and collect from industry the job skills that are needed, because we've got 400,000 unemployed and we've got 40,000 jobs going begging because people in the state don't have the skills to perform them or don't know that those jobs are going begging. And there should be a central place where a man laid off would be able to find out where in the state is there a demand for his particular skill or craft. And this would be a part of this Job Opportunities Board, which I've called JOB for short. But I believe that first we start with this economic settlement of the problem at the same time that we try to solve all those problems that are created simply by the misunderstanding between people. Maybe we better use it when I
Keith Iyengar, General Accounting. The appointment of judges is traditionally and constitutionally an executive function, both for the president and for the governors of the separate states. My question is, what are your specific proposals for taking the appointment of judges, as you say, out of the field of politics?
Well, I favor a program that is similar to something that's being practiced in the state of Missouri right now. And this is the appointment of a committee by the state bar, augmented by some blue ribbon citizens appointed by the governor. And this joint committee of laymen and lawyers will appoint or name a panel based on their experience, qualifications, and personal character. And the governor would then be forced to appoint his judges from that panel. And it would take it out of politics once and for all and make sure of the qualifications of the individuals.
I am Jocelyn Bradford, Key Punch Section. Do you believe that unemployment compensation is an extended vacation for loafers?
No, I don't. And I tell you where that came from. I'll tell you what I do think and where I use that term. The unemployment insurance fund in California has undergone some kind of fast and loose playing. There is a philosophy in Sacramento that openly now says that unemployment insurance must be considered in the same philosophy as welfare. And I don't think it is. I think this is a legitimate insurance program for the protection of legitimate working men and women. But under this plan, they have done away with the possibility of companies or the thing that companies once had of being able to pay a lower tax or no tax at all if they had a good employment record and didn't lay people off. They have raised the tax on the employer. But the money has been going out faster than it's been coming in because under this philosophy of calling it welfare, they have violated the original statute, which said that it was for the protection of a person who was laid off through no fault of their own and should not suffer destitution until they were able to have or get a new job. But under this new philosophy, people are able now to take advantage of loopholes that have been discovered and to voluntarily quit and get this payment. People are able to be fired for cause and find loopholes and get this. In other words, they're basing it not on whether you are eligible, but whether you need it. And what has happened is there has developed a group in our country or in our state who are taking advantage of this. And I say that if we should be faced with a Great Depression, and I understand the governor's been talking about the possibility that such a thing might happen, that we could well find that we did not have the protection we thought we had if the legitimate working men and women, depending on this, suddenly had to call upon it. And I have said that this group, this class that has taken advantage of it, working just long enough to establish eligibility, has become a group who are making it a way of life. Freeloaders who have accepted that unemployment insurance is not for legitimate protection, it's to provide a prepaid annual vacation plan. And this is what I've criticized, and I think the program should be put back on the proper basis so that it can be there when and if the rest of us need it through unemployment.
Harry Shields, Internal Auditing. I'd like to know what sort of a program you advocate for reducing property taxes.
Well, I think there's only one way the property taxes can be reduced. I don't favor the way that's been suggested by Mr. Cranston, which would give take away literally local autonomy from the local taxing agencies. But the great increase in property tax has come about principally from two causes. The state has gathered so much authority with regard to both education and welfare. And then the state dreams up goodies and passes down legislation. Last year it was some 270 pages of legislation aimed at the schools, the local public schools. Programs that the schools have to put into effect, things they have to do, but never has the state proposed or provided the money for implementing those programs. And from the one-time level of paying 50% of the cost of the public school system, the state has dropped to an average of 35%, but actually in metropolitan areas like this, it's even less. I know in Los Angeles it's down to 27%. And what is needed is for the state to accept the responsibility for getting back up to its 50% share of the cost of education. And the same thing has happened with regard to welfare. They dream up new goodies, and the county has to meet it with a certain amount of matching funds. And the county has only one source of revenue. It turns to the property tax. And so the tax has skyrocketed. Now, I believe that the state, by assuming this burden, must envision a broader tax base in which the state would have to have a tax increase only as a substitute to pay this back, so that the local communities then could reduce their taxes proportionately. The suggestion that I have made, I think the most logical. I'm not wedded to this because I advocate a program of complete in-depth tax study. But I believe that the sales tax offers the best and broadest base for this. I think in a tax study we have to review our entire approach to property taxes. I think it's an archaic and outmoded idea to expect property to bear a large share of the general revenue burden. You see, property tax originally was a kind of income tax. It was levied on the large landed estates from whence came the productivity and the income. And I don't think they ever envisioned millions of people owning a little plot of ground and a house. And they certainly didn't envision a credit system in which the millions of people would be living in those homes and only own a limited equity in those homes. But to give you one of the fallacies in the whole tax structure now is you go out with $1,500 and put it down on a down payment on a $20,000 house. You don't own $20,000 worth of real estate, you own $1,500 worth. But the tax collector starts taxing you on the basis of owning $20,000 worth of real estate. And it isn't fair. You haven't become that wealthy. And I think in our system that the most logical system of raising large sums of general revenue is a combination of taxing where it comes in and where it goes out, a combination of income and of sales tax. Hard to see the hands. Sing out.
Right in the back of the room. Let's try that one first.
Yeah.
Andrew Skira, Design Drafting. I have one question to ask. When you're governor of California, what will be your stand on the situation in San Quentin and death row?
Well, I have charged that the situation there perhaps represents a reflection of a philosophy that is widespread in our land about a kind of a soft attitude toward crime, and this philosophy that the individual is no longer responsible for his misdeeds, that society is to blame. And I think that we must have a philosophy of believing that the individual is responsible for his misdeeds and must stand to an accounting for those misdeeds. Now, the situation there grew largely out of the Supreme Court decisions that changed with regard to rules of evidence and so forth. And in California, judicial interpretations at the state level went farther than they did in most states. We went beyond what most states believed the Supreme Court had ordered, and thus we have that pileup that is there, that situation of a kind of moratorium. In addition, there are several there who reflect stays and reprieves that were given prior to those Supreme Court decisions. Now, this is, I'm sure, is an awful threat hanging over a state and over anyone. This great pileup, and I'm sure that the courts, most of these will have to now be decided by the courts, because in most cases they have won the right to a rehearing or a retrial. Then, when the courts have made their decision, the sentence must be carried out. And you might as well know, I happen to believe, even though I think all of us are uncomfortable in saying this, who believe this, all of us who were raised in our Judeo-Christian tradition, we wish it could be otherwise, but I have to believe that the death sentence is a deterrent and does prevent some crimes from being committed, and therefore I believe in the death sentence.
Dan Brand, Engineering Department. I would like to ask you to reply to the quote by Governor Brown yesterday of making the statement, "A tree is a tree, how many can you see?" Is this what you meant, or could you explain what you meant by this, or did you actually say this?
Didn't say it. As a matter of fact, it came from a meeting right here in San Francisco where I was speaking, and I'll explain to you what I did say. And golly, I hope I can hold this one down, because I don't want to run out of time while there's still more questions here. This whole situation involving the redwoods is one in which there's probably been more misinformation than on any issue confronting us. Now, I happen to have been an outdoorsman all my life and a nature lover, and I burn oak wood in the fireplace from our own ranch, but I don't cut down a tree. I wait till a limb falls off and cut it up. I don't like cutting down trees, and I don't believe that the State Highway Department that it's easier for them to bulldoze down the trees than it is to go around. And I'm kind of interested that the governor should think that I have a callous attitude when, if I recall correctly, it was his highway department a short time ago that wanted to push a highway through Fern Canyon in the redwoods, and he said in response to the fact that trees would be lost that, well, we'll plant some more. Now, what I was trying to explain, and about what I think is the misinformation, and I've done my best to study this very much. We have 115,000 acres in 28 state parks of redwoods. Now, only about 50,000 of those comprise what are known as the truly virgin growth, the 2,000-year-old tall tree groves, the great scenic groves. But outside of that 115,000 acres, what they don't tell you is there's only about 6,000 or 8,000 acres of those truly great groves left in private hands. And half of those are earmarked to be added to the present state parks. Now, in speaking to this audience, I was pointing out that the need for a national park is not to preserve the redwoods. Here in California, thanks to public-spirited citizens, we have actually done one of the great conservation jobs of all time in preserving them. We have between a third and a fourth of all of the truly virgin groves preserved that ever existed here in California. Now, I tried to tell this city audience what 115,000 acres, how big it was. And I said if you could lay it out in a grove a mile wide with a road down the middle, so that you had a half a mile of redwood trees on either side, and you took a drive to look at the redwood trees, I said that you'd have to drive almost 200 miles to go through 115,000 acres. And then perhaps where the misunderstanding comes, I said, now, that's a lot of trees to look at, 200 miles of looking at them. And what I was illustrating was that the redwoods are a scenic attraction to look at. Most tourists, we have found, do not go for recreation, because you get 200 feet into them, you're smothered over. There is nothing to see. So this is this scenic attraction. Now, Congressman Don Clausen has proposed a national park plan that makes sense, I believe. I can't all the details. I don't know it that thoroughly. But it is a park proposal to exchange federal and state lands until we have a national park that includes the redwoods, miles and miles of that rugged seacoast, streams, lagoons, some mountainside open land for recreation, and then have a national park that will be helpful to the economy of that area. But I'd like to point out that we have in that area federally owned land now, a federally owned forest in excess of more than half of the land area. The Six Rivers National Forest is 416,000 acres. And the state legislature of California, I might add his own Democratic state legislature, for the last several years has had a resolution saying that if there is to be a national park It is uneconomic to take more land from the private sector, tax-paying land, and the park should be created out of already government-owned land. And I will also add something else. I don't know whether he said this yesterday, because I don't know what he said yesterday. But I do know that he's been saying that I want to sell the state parks. Again, let me give you a little correction, and you tell me if it doesn't make sense, and then if I'm governor, I won't do it. But we have only developed 20% of the land we now own as state park land. The legislative analyst says it'll cost $564 million to develop what we already have. And I have proposed that maybe we should slow down a little bit on acquiring while we develop some of what we have, particularly in the summertime when you people who have campers find that if you don't get there by Friday morning, you can't get into one of our state campgrounds. And I suggested this, the idea of a frequent inventory, that it is possible, buying land this far in advance, that we might buy some that then, as the years go by and it isn't developed, doesn't reflect the growth of the state or the taste of the state. Who could have predicted 15 years ago there would be the great increase in boating that we have today? And I said it's possible that these inventories would reveal that maybe we have too much of the wrong kind of land, and we need some, let's say, of beach or lake frontage or something of this kind of land. And rather than just keep on acquiring, wouldn't it make sense to exchange and to put, if we've got an excess of one kind on the market, but always envisioning in order to buy this other kind of land? And I don't think that that's a very careless idea. I think it kind of makes some ordinary sense. Is there an
I think we have time just for one more question. I know Mr. Reagan has a very busy schedule this afternoon, and we want to do our part to keep him on it. We're in the back corner of the room.
Well, all right, sing out.
Our governor talks much about his famous water plan. However, what he doesn't tell most of the people is that continually he's looked by the problem of flood control up in Northern California. I believe you were up there and saw the mess that was created by the misuse of the watershed up there. They're not properly timbering that land, and they're not taking care of that watershed. This is a little bit different than the tree problem. It's causing real destruction of the rivers and the beds up there. Have you seen this, and what are your feelings about this? Do you plan on doing something about this?
I have seen some of it, and I've talked to forestry men about it, and they have claimed that actually there is a minimum, and there is still lingering from past practices, some mismanagement with regard to the grading of slopes. But we now have legislation about that and laws covering that. And they say that the recent destructive floods was not caused by the sudden loss of a watershed protective cover, but that it actually was the result of these streams piling down into these channels from the excess rain that we had, an almost phenomenal rain in the case of the last floods, that over a certain period of time just brought like a season's moisture at one particular period. But it is true that there isn't the priority on the flood control projects that I think there should be. For example, on the Eel River, the dam that presently is proposed with and has, as I understand it, is out in front now with priority development, is one up at the upper end that would then turn around and channel water back through Clear Lake. Now, this is a good project. It's a Corps of Engineers project, but it would only represent about a control of 13% of the flood potential of that particular river. And I do believe that flood control must be given a high priority, because you and I know that you can have those. This is the home of unusual weather. We don't just have it once. We can have it again and have those same situations. And the only other part of your question that I think that ties in is what I think is some misinformation also, that in order to preserve the redwoods, it is necessary to preserve the watershed around them. And this, again, forestry experts have made plain is not necessarily true. In fact, is not true. That down in the alluvial plains where the great trees are growing, the tall trees, that they're the hardiest thing, and like a weed, they have the ability to out of a stump, come up several additional trees. But I go along with you on the necessity for priority in this flood control plan. Now, about the whole water program, let me point out, the governor neglects to mention that the water program is printed in its entirety over the signature of Governor Goodwin Knight. And yesterday I was in Oroville, and it was kind of interesting there to recall to some of the old-timers who remembered with great pleasure Governor Knight's visit there in 1957 when he turned the first spadeful of earth that started the building of the Oroville Dam. So it just isn't true that when the governor leaves office, he's going to take his water with him. Well, ladies and gentlemen, you've been very kind. I wish there was more time. I should have quit talking earlier. This is more fun with the questions and we get more said. But we have run out of time. Let me just, in closing, because I'm not forgetting the fact I'm a candidate, and I'm here for one reason and one reason only. I would like to have and be very proud to have your support and your votes. But I would like to suggest to you that I'm not soliciting those votes and that support on the basis that I have any idea of going up to Sacramento and running the state of California by myself. As I said earlier, I don't think anyone can, and maybe that's what's been wrong. One man's been trying to. But I would solicit your vote and do solicit it if you believe in yourself, and if you believe, as I do, that the greatness of our state is dependent on the people of this state, that there isn't anything we can't solve with a government that will get out of the way of the people and will take the lead in cooperating with the people, helping present the problems and offering cooperation in solving them. But we here in California, we have the greatest people, I think, to be found in any of the 50 states, and I'm not just being chauvinistic, because we've attracted the people from all of the 50 states. We've attracted the people from every nation of the world. And we didn't build this state by waiting for an area redevelopment program. And they didn't wait for urban renewal before they rebuilt San Francisco after the fire. There isn't anything we can't accomplish if we will mobilize and use the power and the ability of the people of this state. We're the youngest, the most adventurous. We've got the highest level of professional skill and training and education. And I hope to present an administration that will turn to the people for the answers to these problems. You've heard a great deal about my lack of experience. That's true. Lack of experience actually in holding public office. But I know that there comes some times when if you want a job done, maybe you get somebody in who hasn't found out all the things you can't do. I'm quite sure that perhaps I'll make mistakes in that office. But they'll be the mistakes that you can understand. They'll be the mistakes of trying to improve efficiency and productivity, trying to cut overhead and waste and streamline and put modern business practices into the running of this government. I'll go out and try and I'll bludgeon companies like your own to try and get even on a leave of absence basis men and women who are qualified to come in and take over some of the administrative positions. And some of the administrative positions I just won't go out and get anyone for because I don't think they're necessary. They were created as rewards for political favors, and we're not going to give that kind of reward. Partisanship is going to end on November 8th if we're elected, and we're going to set up a government for all of the people. I know that many of you are Democrats, and I offer to you a government not based on any narrow partisan concept, but a government that's based on the idea of all of the people of this state having a voice in their own destiny, some control in running their own affairs, yes, and in spending their own money, because I believe we can have economy and government if we have a governor who believes in economy and who believes the cost can be cut. Now, this is the basis upon which I would solicit your support. And I'm sure that you're all well aware there's been a great tourist trade coming out here in the last several weeks. But I thought it was kind of interesting that one senator who's a citizen of Massachusetts and lives in Virginia and represents New York should be brought out to tell us how to run California. We're not doing that because we believe that this is between the candidates and the people of California. But I'm also interested that the tourist trade representing national leadership on the other side is coming from 3,000 miles away. But leadership in the Democratic Party in this state, most familiar with the problems, is constituting a tourist trade going the other direction. Men like Mayor Yorty and Jesse Unruh and Mrs. Carmen Warshaw, they seem to be avoiding this particular campaign, and I think perhaps they might have some inside knowledge about the way the state has been run. Well, anyway, this is the basis upon which we solicit your support, not only myself, but this entire team that I represent. And I'm going to continue trying to get to as many of you as I can, talking on the issues and making specific recommendations in the last few days of the campaign. And then if you should choose the philosophy that I've expressed, I would be proud and happy to have it, and I shall do my utmost to give us a government that will be truly of and by, as well as for the people. Thank you very much.
You're watching American History TV. All week